What if the richest man in America discovered that all his money, all his power, couldn't heal the one person he loved most? What if the key to his redemption came not from wealth or influence, but from a forgotten waitress who carried a truth strong enough to shatter his empire and rebuild his soul? This is not just a story of power and downfall. It is a story of a single step, a fragile child's courage, and a silent revolution that money could never buy.
The crisp autumn evening wrapped Washington, D.C. in a cloak of golden light and sharp winds, the kind that swept fallen leaves into tight spirals across the marble steps of the Capitol. Inside the city's most prestigious hotel, however, no such chill existed. Heat, wealth, and power radiated from every corner of the grand ballroom, where chandeliers glittered like constellations, and the air carried the scent of aged wine and imported lilies. Tonight was not just another gala. It was the gala, the kind of event where senators, billionaires, and industry titans rubbed shoulders, and where every handshake was a subtle negotiation. Cameras flashed discreetly, journalists whispered at the edges, and lobbyists circled like sharks in tailored suits. At the center of this constellation of power stood Senator William Carter. At 54, he was the embodiment of authority, tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could command a Senate chamber or charm a fundraiser dinner with equal ease. His tailored tuxedo was as precise as his reputation, immaculate, unyielding, intimidating. To the public, he was a visionary lawmaker. To his colleagues, a deal-maker whose endorsement could make or break careers. To his enemies, a ruthless strategist who never forgave or forgot. But tonight, the senator carried something else with him, something that drew whispers and sidelong glances as much as his presence usually demanded respect. Beside him, at the table reserved for the Carter family, sat his 12-year-old son, David. David Carter was not a stranger to the press, though not in the way his father might have wished. 2 years earlier, a car accident had left him with severe spinal injuries. Since then, David lived mostly out of the public eye, confined to a wheelchair, and shrouded in the quiet grief of a childhood interrupted. His mother had left years earlier, unwilling to bear the cold loneliness of William Carter's ambitions. That left David in the care of nannies, tutors, and the occasional stiff attempt from his father to connect. The boy's presence at the gala was a calculated risk. It was the first time since the accident that William had brought him to such a public, scrutinized place. The senator's aides had whispered their concerns, but William insisted. It was time, he declared, for his son to be seen again. Still, a tension lingered in his jaw every time he noticed another pair of eyes drifting toward David. David himself was silent, his thin frame wrapped in a dark suit, his pale hands folded in his lap. The music from the live orchestra drifted softly, violins weaving a melancholy pattern, yet his eyes were elsewhere. Not on the food, not on the politicians or businessmen who occasionally offered him a sympathetic smile, but on the staff weaving gracefully between tables. Among them was Elena Rodriguez. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being overlooked. Dressed in the crisp uniform of the hotel staff, her presence was invisible to most, the kind of invisibility that came from years of blending in. Yet to David she was not invisible. There was something in the calm way she balanced her tray, in the gentle patience she offered when she stopped at his side to refill his glass of water. Unlike the guests around him, she didn't stare with pity. She simply acknowledged him, as though his wheelchair was not the first or only thing that defined him. David watched her for a long time. Then, as the orchestra shifted to a softer melody, something inside him stirred, a memory perhaps, or a longing buried too long. He turned his head toward Elena as she passed again. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but in the sudden hush of a pause between songs it carried. "Would you dance with me?" The words fell into the air like a stone into still water. Conversations faltered. Glasses paused midair. Heads turned. In that ballroom, filled with senators and CEOs, silence descended heavy and immediate. William Carter's hand stiffened around his glass. His aide, seated nearby, blinked in horror. The maitre d', hovering discreetly near the doors, began to stride forward, ready to restore order. Elena froze. For a moment, she wasn't the invisible waitress anymore. Dozens of eyes burned into her, demanding an answer. The maitre d's voice sliced through the tension. "Sir, control your son. This is highly inappropriate. Our staff are not here to entertain guests. Especially not—" He stopped, realizing the edge of his words. But the damage was already done. William's voice came low, like a growl meant to be heard only at his table. "David, sit down," but the boy didn't move. His hand, thin and trembling, extended awkwardly toward Elena. His face was pale, but his eyes, they carried a desperate spark. Elena's chest tightened. In her years working double shifts, first at a clinic, now at events like this, she had learned the art of silence, of stepping back, of being invisible. But this moment refused invisibility. She unfastened the apron at her waist, placed it gently on her tray, and set the tray down. Her voice, when it came, was calm but firm. "I can't dance in an apron." Gasps rippled through the room. Before Senator Carter could react, Elena stepped forward and placed her hand gently in David's. She bent slightly, not to help him, but to match his height, to meet him where he was. David's fingers tightened around hers. With a shaky motion, he maneuvered his chair forward, his other hand pushing against the wheel as though trying to rise. The orchestra faltered, unsure whether to continue, until one of the violinists, perhaps moved by the sight, began to play again, a single soft melody that filled the silence. Step by painful step, David shifted, trying to lead. His body betrayed him, his legs trembling, braces creaking with every strained effort. Yet Elena didn't pull him, didn't steady him beyond what was necessary. She matched his halting rhythm, letting him set the pace. Whispers swirled around the tables. Some guests leaned in with fascinated horror. Others muttered that she'd lose her job by morning. William Carter stood frozen, his jaw tight, torn between outrage and something else, something lodged deep in his chest. For a moment, the world shrank to a child's trembling determination and a woman's steady courage. When the brief, clumsy dance ended, Elena lowered herself gracefully, guiding David back into his chair. She squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you for asking me," she whispered, though in the silence of the ballroom everyone heard. Then she turned, ready to leave, but William Carter's voice cut across the room. "Wait." The silence that followed William Carter's command stretched longer than anyone expected. His voice had not boomed, not thundered with the authority he wielded so easily in the Senate chamber. Instead, it sounded different, rough, almost unfamiliar, even to him. Dozens of eyes remained fixed on the trio at the center of the ballroom. The boy in the wheelchair, the waitress who dared to defy the invisible line separating guest from servant, and the senator whose reputation for control now seemed to waver. "Wait," he had said, and so the entire room waited. Elena turned slowly, her hand still trembling from the weight of the moment. She had no illusions about what might come next. People like William Carter didn't forgive disruptions. He was the kind of man whose nod could secure a contract, whose silence could end a career. She had interrupted his carefully managed facade, exposed his son in a way he clearly had not intended, and challenged the unwritten rules of this gilded gathering. "Your name," William said at last. His eyes narrowed, not in anger alone, but in something far murkier. "Elena Rodriguez." "Sir?" Her voice did not quiver. It surprised even her, how steady it sounded when her heart pounded so loudly she thought the chandeliers might hear it. William repeated it slowly, as though committing it to memory. "Elena Rodriguez." From the inside pocket of his tuxedo, he drew a slim ivory card and held it out. The gesture was deliberate, sharp enough to slice the air. "My office, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." A ripple ran through the room, a collective intake of breath. The senator was not known for second chances. For most, an invitation from him was not an opportunity but a summons, one that could redefine lives. Elena hesitated only a fraction of a second before accepting the card. She didn't thank him. She simply nodded, then turned to resume her path through the maze of tables. Her steps felt heavier now, her back a taut line against the weight of the stairs that followed. At their table, David looked up at his father, confusion and curiosity shining in his eyes. "Why did you do that?" The boy's voice was soft, but in William's ears it rang like a verdict. He did not answer. Could not. His gaze remained fixed on the polished surface of the table, on the distorted reflection of a man who suddenly looked like a stranger to himself. The music resumed, Conversation returned in hesitant ripples, but the night had already shifted. Nothing would return to how it had been. Back in her small apartment on the outskirts of the city, Elena sat at the edge of her bed, the senator's card balanced on her palm like a coin she wasn't sure whether to spend or discard. The room was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Her best outfit, a navy blouse and second-hand skirt she'd worn to the gala, hung carefully from the closet door, still faintly carrying the scent of lilies and champagne. She had worked countless events over the years, but none like tonight. None that left her hands trembling long after. None that stirred memories she'd worked hard to bury. On the bedside table sat a worn leather-bound notebook, its corners frayed from years of use. Inside, pages overflowed with careful notes, observations, sketches, plans. Words like movement therapy, child autonomy, neuroplasticity scrawled across margins. Diagrams of exercises, lists of case studies. The notebook was her secret, a relic of a future she once chased. Before life forced her into detours of survival, her sister Zoe had called earlier, reminding her to lock the back door of the community center after class tomorrow. Their project, the one they had poured years into, was struggling to survive. Rent was overdue, grants had dried up, and the children who came there each week danced on a floor that threatened to collapse as surely as their funding. Elena traced the embossed lettering on the senator's card with her finger. William Carter, U.S. Senate. The weight of his name pressed down on her chest. He was the kind of man who had power to change laws with a single vote, to save or sink entire communities with a shift in budget priorities. He was also the kind of man who had looked at her tonight not as a waitress, not even as a woman, but as someone who had just broken into his carefully controlled world. She should have been afraid. Perhaps she was. But beneath the fear, something else burned, a quiet determination sharpened by years of being underestimated. Tomorrow, she would face him. Not as a servant, but as someone who had nothing left to lose. For William Carter, sleep came fitfully. He poured himself a glass of bourbon after the gala, retreating to the library of his Georgetown townhouse. The shelves, lined with volumes of law, history, and economics, stared back at him like mute judges. His late-night ritual, paperwork, phone calls, calculations offered no comfort tonight. The image refused to leave his mind. David, struggling to rise, his braces creaking, his body trembling, but his eyes alive in a way William hadn't seen since before the accident. And Elena Rodriguez, that waitress, refusing to pity him, refusing to take control, letting the boy lead despite his faltering steps. For 2 years, William had surrounded David with specialists, neurologists, therapists, physicians, all at the top of their fields. He had spared no expense. Yet not one of them had managed to draw out what a stranger had revealed in a matter of minutes. It wasn't logical. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't even dignified in the polished world William lived in. But it was real. And that reality gnawed at him like a wound he couldn't ignore. When dawn broke, he was still awake, the bourbon glass empty, the invitation card he'd given Elena glaring at him from the desk as though daring him to follow through. Suspense hummed like a wire stretched too tight. Tomorrow would bring answers or perhaps only more questions. But one thing was certain. The careful order of William Carter's world had already been disrupted, and it was Elena Rodriguez, waitress, stranger, nobody, who had lit the fuse. The marble floors of the Russell Senate office building gleamed beneath Elena's shoes as she walked, each step echoing louder than she would have liked. She had borrowed a blazer from Zoe, pressed her blouse twice that morning, and still felt woefully out of place among the polished corridors where portraits of past lawmakers stared down like silent sentinels. A receptionist guided her through a set of glass doors etched with the words Senator William Carter. Behind them lay a reception area that felt more like a museum than an office. Walls adorned with framed photographs of ribbon cuttings, foreign visits, and smiling campaign crowds. Every image reinforced the same message. Power lived here. The senator was not waiting for her. Instead, an aide intercepted her. A woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, sharper heels, and a tablet clutched like a weapon. "Ms. Rodriguez," the aide said crisply, "follow me." She led Elena into a smaller conference room, its long oak table polished to a mirror finish. A carafe of water and 2 glasses sat at the center, untouched. The aide gestured for her to sit but remained standing herself, watching as though studying a specimen under glass. "You know," the aide began, "you've created quite a stir. Interrupting a gala like that, drawing the senator's son into whatever that was." Elena folded her hands calmly in her lap. "David asked me to dance. I said yes." The aide tilted her head, clearly dissatisfied. "You don't seem to understand the gravity of what happened. Senator Carter's image is controlled," Elena finished softly. "I noticed." For a moment, silence. Then the aide's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise betraying her practiced composure. The door opened before the conversation could continue. William Carter entered, his presence immediately shifting the air. He wore the same impeccable suit as always, but something about him seemed less untouchable this morning. Perhaps it was the faint shadows under his eyes, or the fact that he carried no papers, no phone, only his own conflicted thoughts. "Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez," he said, gesturing for the aide to leave. The woman hesitated but obeyed, the door clicking shut behind her. For several seconds, neither spoke. William moved to the window, looking out at the Capitol dome, his hands clasped behind his back. Elena remained seated, steady despite the weight of the silence. Finally, he turned. "You embarrassed me last night." His tone was measured, but his eyes betrayed the storm beneath. Elena did not flinch. "I didn't mean to embarrass anyone. Your son asked me to dance. I gave him respect enough to say yes." "Respect," William repeated as though tasting the word for the first time. He studied her, his gaze searching for something he couldn't quite name. "Do you know how many therapists, specialists, experts I've hired for David? 2 years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. And not one of them could do what you did in 5 minutes." Elena's brow furrowed. "What I did? You made him try," William said simply. His voice cracked slightly, betraying more than he intended. "You made him want to stand again." The admission hung in the air like fragile glass. Elena leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind. "Senator, it wasn't me. It was him. You've given him every expert, every machine, every program, but you haven't given him freedom. You haven't let him be a boy who chooses, even if he chooses to stumble." The words hit harder than William expected. He bristled instinctively, the politician in him recoiling from challenge. But another part of him, the father he had buried beneath layers of strategy and control, could not ignore the truth. "Who are you, Ms. Rodriguez?" he asked at last. The question was not rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to know. Elena hesitated. She could have said a waitress. She could have said no one. But that wasn't the truth, and something in William's gaze demanded honesty. "I studied physical therapy," she admitted. "I never finished. Life got complicated. Now I run a small community program with my sister, dance movement rehabilitation, for kids who can't afford specialists." William's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had walked away from her path but never abandoned her purpose. Someone who, in one night, had done what his expensive empire of resources had failed to achieve. For the first time, he felt the balance of power shift, not in his office, not in his favor, but toward this woman who sat across from him without flinching. "Come back tomorrow," he said finally. "Bring your notes." "All of them." Elena blinked. "Notes? I know you have them," William replied, his eyes sharper now. "You don't strike me as someone who stopped learning just because she stopped school." Her pulse quickened. He was right. Her notebook, the one filled with years of sketches and theories, suddenly felt heavier than ever. She rose slowly. "And if I say no?" William's gaze hardened. "Then you walk away, and nothing changes." A silence stretched between them, taut and electric. Elena slipped the senator's card into her blazer pocket and met his eyes one last time. "I'll think about it." Then she turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing once more through the marble halls. Behind her, William Carter remained at the window, his reflection staring back like a man caught between two worlds, the world he built and the one he had just glimpsed. Through Elena Rodriguez, he didn't know yet which would win. But for the first time in years, he felt the ground beneath him shift. The night after Elena walked out of the towering office, she could not sleep. Her small apartment seemed to shrink around her, walls pressing in like silent judges waiting for her to admit some secret she did not even know she held. The city outside was alive with horns and sirens, Yet her own breath was the loudest sound in the room. She replayed every step of her meeting with Senator William Carter, the way his voice had shifted from command to hesitation, the way his eyes had revealed the fracture between control and grief. Most of all, she thought of David, the boy whose trembling hand had reached across the distance of silence in a grand hall of strangers. She could still feel the weight of his determination in her palm, a weight that seemed to anchor her more than all the noise of her life ever had. Elena told herself she had done the right thing. She had walked away, held her dignity, refused to let herself be bought like another commodity in the senator's portfolio. But in the corners of her mind, she also knew that something had begun, something she had not chosen but could not escape. For the first time in years, her mission did not belong only to herself and her sister, or the handful of children who came to Freedom's steps. It had found a new center, a new face, and that face had been covered with uncertainty, pride, and hope all at once. In his own world, William Carter too lay awake. The penthouse around him glowed faintly from the skyline, yet he felt no light inside. His career had been built on iron decisions, quick judgments, a refusal to let anyone see hesitation. But the woman had turned her back on him with calm certainty, and in that moment he had felt smaller than he had in decades. He had offered wealth, position, stability, and she had chosen something he did not understand, the right to walk away. He kept seeing his son's small smile, fragile but alive, and for the first time since the accident, Carter realized that his wealth and political machinery had done nothing to create that moment. It had come from somewhere else, from a woman who had no power at all in his world, yet carried more in her quiet step than he could summon with his empire. David, meanwhile, woke the next morning with a strange warmth in his chest. The braces still weighed on his legs. The routine of pain and hesitation remained, but there was a thread of something new winding through his thoughts. He remembered not the stares of the crowd nor the sharp command of the manager, but the steady rhythm of Elena's movement as she walked with him, not ahead, not behind, but beside. For a boy who had been led by nurses, guided by therapists, and corrected by specialists, that single act of following his pace was like discovering air after being underwater too long. He tried to explain it to his father over breakfast, but William's face had been distracted, eyes fixed on papers, mind trapped in politics. Yet David noticed the smallest flicker when he mentioned Elena's name, as if his father could not quite dismiss the memory. Rumors began to stir in the political circles that week. A billionaire senator's son seen in public, attempting to dance with a waitress, whispers about impropriety and speculation about what it meant. Allies called to remind Carter of optics. Rivals smirked behind headlines about weakness, and the media began to taste a story that could turn into scandal. The senator, who had survived battles of legislation and finance, suddenly felt cornered by something as small and unstoppable as a child's decision. Elena, unaware of the ripples in the marble halls of power, continued her work at the community center. Children arrived dragging braces or wheeling themselves through the old warehouse, faces lighting up at the chance to move without judgment. She poured herself into their progress, but she carried the memory of David like a secret flame. She told herself it was only because he represented all the children they worked for, but in truth she felt a pull stronger than mission. He had looked at her with the kind of trust that cannot be requested, only given freely. And she had accepted it, even if she did not yet know what it meant. Days later, a black car appeared outside the center. Its windows tinted, its presence heavy against the cracked pavement. Zoe spotted it first, her hand tightening nervously around a clipboard. Elena tried to ignore it, but then she saw the door open. A small figure emerged, braces catching the light, determination steady despite the hesitation in each step. David had come. Behind him, still inside the car, William Carter sat like a man fighting himself, every instinct telling him to drive away, every memory reminding him of what his son had looked like when he smiled. Inside the warehouse, children paused as David entered. Some stared with curiosity, others with shy recognition of someone who looked like them but lived a life worlds apart. Elena walked forward, her heart steadying as she greeted him, treating him not as a guest of privilege but as another child ready to find his own rhythm. David's eyes lit with relief. For once he was not a spectacle, not a project, not an obligation. He was simply a boy invited to move. From outside the glass windows, William Carter watched. His pulse hammered as if he were at a political debate. Yet all he faced was his son's small attempt at freedom. When David began to move with the other children, guided not by correction but by possibility, Carter felt the weight of his empire tilt. He realized that what was happening in that cracked warehouse might undo or save everything he had built. And in that realization was born the first thread of suspense. For Carter's rivals were already sharpening their knives, waiting for any sign of weakness. A senator who bowed to a waitress who allowed his son to be led by a woman of no status would be easy prey. Yet the father who ignored his son's fragile new steps might lose something that could never be regained. The choice would soon be forced, and the world was watching. The following weeks unfolded like a slow storm gathering momentum. Elena noticed the subtle changes in David each time he came to the community center. At first he lingered near the wall, cautious and hesitant, his body stiff with the memory of years spent being corrected. But gradually his steps began to loosen, the braces no longer just instruments of limitation but tools of resilience. He began to mimic the movements of other children, not out of competition but out of wonder, as if discovering that his own body could tell stories he had thought forever silenced. The other children welcomed him with a quiet generosity. They did not care that his father's name was whispered in newspapers, or that his arrival was shadowed by a sleek car outside. To them he was simply David, another child in search of freedom. Elena watched the bonds forming, how the children encouraged each other, how their small victories became shared celebrations. It filled her with both hope and unease. Hope, because she saw David shedding the invisible cage that had trapped him since the accident. Unease, because she knew that with every step he took, the walls of William Carter's carefully constructed world trembled. Carter himself kept his distance at first. He remained outside, seated in the car or standing by the door, never stepping fully into the room. His figure was an odd contrast against the peeling paint and handmade posters, his tailored suits and polished shoes foreign in a space that smelled of dust and determination. Yet his eyes betrayed something he could not hide. Each time David managed a new motion, each time laughter echoed from his son's lips, Carter's expression faltered. He looked less like the unshakable senator, and more like a man who had lost his map in unfamiliar territory. In the halls of power, whispers grew louder. A photo had leaked. William Carter standing near the entrance of the community center, his face caught in an unguarded moment of vulnerability. It spread through digital headlines like a spark on dry grass. Commentators speculated on the meaning. Rivals spun stories of distraction and weakness. Allies urged him to distance himself before the narrative consumed him. But Carter, for all his calculated instincts, found himself resisting the pull of strategy. Each time he considered retreat, the memory of his son's hesitant smile pulled him forward again. Elena was not naive to these ripples. She saw the occasional reporters lingering near the center, the photographers trying to capture glimpses of the senator's visits. She felt the weight of attention pressing into a space that had always existed outside the glare of wealth and politics. Yet she refused to let it shift her focus. She reminded herself daily that her work had begun long before David and would continue long after. Still, there were moments late at night when she wondered what kind of storm she was inviting into their fragile sanctuary. Zoe, ever protective, raised the question directly one evening as they cleaned up after class. What happens when the senator decides his reputation is more valuable than his son's progress? Elena had no answer because she knew that possibility was real. William Carter's world thrived on control, and control did not coexist with the unpredictable freedom she encouraged. The suspense lay in the unknown, whether his power would crush their mission or whether his son's quiet determination would soften the man's iron grip. David, however, seemed oblivious to the political undercurrents. For him, the center became a second home, a place where his limitations did not define him but rather became part of a shared journey. He began practicing at night in his own room, small steps that echoed like thunder in the halls of the penthouse. The household staff noticed, whispering that the boy seemed alive again, though none dared mention it directly to the senator. Carter himself noticed the faint scuff marks on the hardwood floors, signs of braces dragging in late hours, and instead of anger he felt a quiet ache, the realization that his son was reaching for something beyond the safety of his control. Then came the moment that turned whispers into a storm. During one of the sessions, David attempted something bold. He loosened one of his braces, determined to test his balance without full support. The room grew silent as he steadied himself, small hands clenched into fists of determination. Elena watched closely, resisting the urge to intervene, letting him discover his own boundary. Slowly, with a trembling body and fierce concentration, he took a step. It was small, uneven, almost fragile, but it was his own. The cheer that followed filled the warehouse like a tide. Children clapped, Zoe's eyes welled with tears, and even the usually reserved Dr. Mercer, who had been observing from the corner, allowed herself a smile. Outside, unnoticed by the children, a journalist captured the moment through a cracked door. Within hours, the photo was everywhere. The senator's son taking a shaky but independent step, surrounded by children whose faces shone with joy. For William Carter, the world tilted again. He returned to the center that evening, finding Elena alone, sweeping the floor after the children had left. He stood for a long time in silence, watching the dust rise and settle with each stroke of her broom. Though no words passed between them, both knew that something irreversible had happened. The world had seen, and the world would demand a response. The suspense deepened in the days that followed. Headlines celebrated the boy's courage, while simultaneously questioning the senator's priorities. Rivals suggested he was exploiting his son for political sympathy. Allies pressed him to release statements to shape the story before it spiraled. Yet Carter hesitated, torn between instinct and revelation. For the first time in his career, he considered the possibility that the right answer was not the one that preserved his image, but the one that preserved his son's fragile hope. Elena felt the shift too. She saw the reporters waiting at the corner of her street, felt the curious glances of neighbors, sensed the weight of expectation pressing against her quiet life. Freedom Steps was no longer a hidden program struggling in obscurity. It had become a symbol, one that carried both promise and danger. She feared that the same spotlight which illuminated their mission could also burn it to ashes. Yet despite the fear, she also felt a quiet strength. The story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the children, to David, to every parent who longed to see their child take a first step without the weight of pity or perfection. And in the heart of it all, William Carter stood on a precipice. The man who had once believed that control and wealth could bend the world to his will, now faced a truth he could neither buy nor command. His son's fragile progress had become a beacon, and the entire nation was watching to see whether the senator would shield that flame or snuff it out in pursuit of power. As autumn settled over the city, the weight of expectation thickened around William Carter's world. Campaign banners fluttered on street corners, debates filled the airwaves, and his rivals circled like vultures. Yet behind every handshake and polished speech, his thoughts strayed to a dim warehouse where his son was learning to claim his own fragile freedom. The contrast gnawed at him. The marble halls of power that demanded loyalty and calculation, and the cracked floors of a community center that demanded only patience and humanity. He began to notice the growing distance between himself and the machinery he had once mastered. Advisors pressed him to redirect the narrative, to frame his son's journey as a carefully managed symbol of resilience under his own guidance. Publicists drafted statements that wrapped David's courage in political slogans, each line stripped of authenticity. But every time Carter read the words, his chest tightened. He saw his son's trembling hand steadying itself on a wall, remembered the sound of laughter echoing off broken plaster, and realized that to turn those moments into campaign fodder would be a betrayal deeper than any scandal. David continued to change in quiet ways that defied headlines. He laughed more easily. He argued when told to rest. He lingered after sessions to help younger children with their braces or wheels. Elena noticed that he no longer avoided his reflection in the cracked mirror near the storage room. Instead, he studied himself with curiosity as if meeting someone new. The other children admired him not because of his father's name, but because he had dared to try what frightened them all. In those moments, David became more than a senator's son. He became proof that struggle could carry dignity. Elena felt pride, but also a deepening anxiety. The attention surrounding David had drawn donors, media, and political operatives into their fragile world. The community center, once ignored, now hummed with strangers eager to claim a piece of its story. With each visit, Elena worried that the purity of their mission was slipping through her fingers. Freedom Steps was never meant to be a stage for ambition. It was meant to be a refuge for the broken and the brave. She wrestled with the fear that the very light that had made their work visible would also destroy its soul. The storm finally broke on a night of polished lights and sharp questions. Carter stood on the debate stage, cameras glaring, his rival pressing him about priorities. Why, the rival demanded. Should the people trust a senator distracted by personal drama, one whose son's rehabilitation had become tabloid fodder? The crowd murmured, the moderators leaned forward, and the nation held its breath. Carter felt the old instincts rising. Deflect, control, strike back. But then he saw in his mind the moment David had taken that unassisted step. His face lit, not by approval, but by discovery. For the first time in his career, Carter hesitated not from weakness but from the weight of truth. He answered without strategy, his voice carrying the rawness of a man who had stopped pretending. He spoke of failure, of the years he had hidden his son's struggle, of the arrogance that believed power could shield him from pain. And then he spoke of change, of watching a boy teach him that resilience cannot be orchestrated, that dignity cannot be purchased. The words were imperfect, vulnerable, and utterly unplanned. The reaction was immediate and divisive. Some hailed his honesty as a rare moment of humanity in politics. Others called it recklessness, a confession that would cost him dearly. Donors panicked, rivals pounced, and yet Carter himself felt lighter than he had in years. He had chosen truth over control, and though it might cost him power, it preserved something far more fragile: his son's trust. But truth has its own consequences. The following morning, headlines screamed of weakness. Poll numbers wavered, allies distanced themselves, and whispers of replacement within the party grew louder. For the first time, William Carter's empire seemed to crack. Yet in the quiet of his penthouse, none of that mattered as much as the sight of David practicing steps across the living room, determination shining in his face. Elena's influence lingered in every movement, her belief stitched into the boy's courage. Elena, too, felt the shift. She watched the debate on an old television in the office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and the faint smell of dust. When Carter spoke, she saw not the senator but the father. For a moment she allowed herself to believe that even men built of marble and steel could bend toward something human. Yet she also knew storms do not pass easily. Power does not forgive vulnerability, and the world rarely allows men like William Carter to walk freely away from their thrones. The suspense deepened when threats arrived, not against Carter, but against the center itself. Anonymous letters warned of inspections, permits questioned, funding pulled. It was a reminder that their work existed not only in the fragile steps of children, but also in the shadow of politics that sought to control every narrative. Elena refused to yield, but she felt the pressure mounting. Freedom Steps was no longer invisible, and that visibility carried a price. One evening, as rain battered the city and thunder rolled across the skyline, William Carter appeared at the center without his entourage. He stood dripping in the doorway, his presence heavy with unspoken decisions. The children had gone, the lights flickered, and Elena found herself facing a man stripped of pretense. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he offer promises. He simply stood, torn between two worlds, knowing that whichever path he chose would change everything. In that silence, the story of Part 2 reached its precipice. Carter had to decide whether to retreat to the safety of power or step into the unknown of truth and sacrifice. David's fragile progress, the center's survival, and the weight of an empire all balanced on the edge of his choice. The storm outside raged, mirroring the storm within, and for the first time both Elena and William realized that no one, not power, not faith, not love, could guarantee what came next. The cliffhanger held in the charged air, a father on the brink of losing everything, a son discovering himself, and a woman caught between mission and destiny. The city waited, the nation whispered, and the story pressed forward into uncertainty. The storm had not been invited, yet it came with a force that seemed almost prophetic, as if the skies themselves had chosen to mirror the unrest within William Carter's heart. The rain drummed against the roof of the community center like 1,000 anxious hands, and the lightning fractured the night into violent glimpses of truth. Inside, the air was heavy with expectation. Elena stood near the far wall, her posture straight, but her mind pulled taut between fear and quiet determination. She knew what his presence here meant, and though he had not spoken a word, she could feel the gravity of his choice pressing into the room. William Carter had always been a man of control, His empire had been built upon the certainty that he alone directed its movements, that no storm could shake its foundation. Yet here he was, standing at the threshold of a modest building filled with children whose laughter and fragile bravery carried more power than all the speeches he had ever delivered. The empire outside was beginning to collapse, though not from financial ruin or political defeat, but from something far more insidious, the erosion of certainty, the crumbling of the walls he had built around his heart. David was in the center of the room, his braces glinting under the dim lights as he moved with a determination that defied his trembling legs. Each hesitant step was its own rebellion, each faltering pause a declaration that progress did not need perfection to exist. The boy did not look at his father immediately. His gaze was focused inward, on the fragile rhythm his body was learning to trust. But when the thunder cracked louder than before, his eyes flickered toward the doorway, and in that brief glance, William saw both trust and question. The boy did not ask for permission, nor did he beg for approval. He simply looked at his father as if to say, "This is who I am becoming. Will you stand with me or will you turn away?" The weight of that silent question pressed harder than any political scandal, any headline, any whispered betrayal among his allies. For weeks, whispers had multiplied into open attacks. Colleagues who had once praised his discipline now questioned his judgment. Anonymous letters had arrived at his office, some filled with warnings, others with veiled threats. Reporters lingered at the edges of his public appearances, hungry for cracks in his armor. His connection to a modest community center, to a black woman whose name was whispered with curiosity and disdain in certain circles, had become a point of speculation. To his opponents it was weakness. To his allies it was recklessness. To him it was both and neither, because it was not about politics anymore. It was about the boy at the center of the room, the boy whose broken body carried the spark of something William himself had lost long ago. Elena felt the storm of tension building even without a word exchanged. She could see it in Carter's stance, in the way his jaw tightened, in the restless shift of his hands. He was a man being pulled in two directions, his empire on one side, his son on the other. She feared what choice he might make, for though she had grown to respect the glimpses of humanity he had revealed, she knew that pride and power had deeper roots in his life than compassion. She had seen men like him before who could sacrifice anything, anyone when cornered. David's progress had accelerated in recent weeks. His movements were clumsy but determined, his smile hesitant but growing in frequency. He had begun to influence the other children, not through authority but through example. They saw in him a mirror of their own struggles, and when he found the courage to try again after every stumble, they found courage too. The room had transformed into more than a class. It had become a sanctuary of possibility, a fragile ecosystem where failure was not shame but evidence of effort. Elena guarded that space fiercely, knowing how easily it could be shattered by the intrusion of politics, by the weight of an empire that sought to own rather than nurture. The storm outside seemed to intensify in rhythm with the storm within Carter. His advisors had warned him. Some urged him to retreat, to sever ties with this place before it poisoned his reputation beyond repair. Others urged him to take control of it, to claim it as part of his empire, to spin the narrative into one of generosity and leadership. Yet none had advised him to do what his heart was whispering now, to let go, to surrender the control that had defined his existence. For a man who had spent decades mastering the art of leadership, the thought of following, of trusting someone else's rhythm, was almost unthinkable. The attacks against the center had grown more vicious. At first they were whispers of impropriety, questions about funding and safety. Then came the fabricated reports of violations, anonymous complaints filed with city authorities, inspectors sent under political pressure. Elena had faced them all with quiet strength, but she knew the force behind them was not random. Someone wanted to shut them down, and she suspected William's rivals were pulling the strings. Each notice, each inspection, each false accusation chipped away at their already fragile resources. And yet David kept walking. His progress did not stop. In fact, the more chaos swirled outside, the more determined he became inside the studio. His fragile independence became a beacon for others, drawing attention not only from families and children, but from journalists curious about the story of a boy who was defying medical predictions. The center began to attract coverage, and though Elena resisted the spotlight, she knew it was both a blessing and a danger. Attention could bring funding, but it could also bring destruction if twisted by the wrong hands. Carter was caught in that paradox. The empire he had built depended on image, on perception, on control of narrative. The center represented everything he could not control, everything unpredictable. And yet it was there, in that unpredictability, that his son was healing. The storm inside him reached its breaking point the night the closure notice arrived. Elena had found it taped to the door, the official seal mocking her as the rain soaked the paper. The accusation was absurd. Unsafe conditions, unqualified supervision, mismanagement. She knew it was a weapon, not a truth. She also knew they could not survive another shutdown, not without outside support. When William arrived that night, the decision had already been made in someone else's office, but the choice now rested with him. He could let it happen, preserving his political image at the cost of his son's fragile progress. Or he could intervene, risking everything for something he could not fully control. He stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, eyes fixed on Elena as if searching for an answer she could not give. For David, the storm meant nothing. He had taken another step, one brace removed, his balance shaky but his determination unbroken. For him, the world was not politics, not power, not the fragile empire his father clung to. It was a room filled with possibility, with children who understood him, with a teacher who believed in him. He was too young to understand the war being fought over his steps, but he was old enough to feel the weight of his father's gaze. Elena turned away from Carter and focused on the boy because that was where the truth lay. In the rhythm of uncertain steps, in the courage of imperfection, in the resilience of a child who refused to give up. She knew Carter was watching, and she knew the choice before him. But she also knew that true transformation never came from words spoken in comfort. It came in storms, when the cost was highest, when the easy path was retreat and the harder path was surrender. William Carter faced that moment now. The empire outside was shaking, his rivals sharpening their knives, his advisors demanding retreat. But inside this room his son was walking. Inside this room the storm carried a different weight, the weight of truth, the weight of possibility, the weight of a choice that no amount of wealth or power could buy. And as the thunder rolled again, louder than before, the man who had built his life on control realized that he could no longer lead this moment. He could only follow. The storm did not relent, and neither did the storm that raged within William Carter's life. The closure notice had been more than a document. It was a weapon crafted to strike precisely where he was weakest. His son's fragile progress was tethered to this place, this woman, this fragile idea that freedom could be nurtured outside the walls of hospitals and beyond the reach of specialists. Yet the empire that sustained his influence demanded order, demanded that he step away, demanded that he crush anything that risked the appearance of instability. For years, Carter had lived in a world where perception was reality. His advisors drilled it into him daily. Power was not in action but in narrative, not in truth but in control of what people believed to be truth. That belief had built his empire, had made him untouchable, had given him the illusion that he could command storms rather than be broken by them. But here, in this modest center with its peeling paint and handmade posters, perception was irrelevant. A child's progress could not be spun into a headline without risking its very authenticity. His son's smile was not a political tool but a fragile, sacred thing that could crumble under the weight of ambition. David did not care about notices or empires. He cared about the next step, about the rhythm of his own body, about the invisible cage he was breaking with each movement. He had begun to dream again, not in words but in possibilities. He would wake in the mornings with questions about balance, about strength, about when he could try walking without both braces. Elena had encouraged him not with promises of miracles but with the quiet assurance that effort itself was victory. It was this quiet, relentless encouragement that had begun to heal something deeper than his legs. The wound of being seen as broken, the wound of being treated as fragile glass. Elena herself carried storms within her. Each day brought new challenges, balancing shifts at her other jobs, caring for the center, shielding the children from the political crossfire that was beginning to swirl around them. She was not blind to the dangers. She knew the attacks were escalating, knew that the closure notice would not be the last, and yet she refused to surrender the space they had built. It was more than a program. It was a sanctuary where dignity replaced pity, where progress was measured not in medical charts but in courage. She also knew that William Carter stood at the edge of a precipice. She had seen the war in his eyes, the pull between empire and son, between pride and surrender. She did not trust him fully. How could she when men like him had so often used people like her as stepping stones? And yet she had glimpsed something in him that gave her pause, something beyond ambition. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was grief, perhaps it was the first fragile stirrings of humility. Whatever it was not yet strong enough to guarantee he would choose the right path. The media had begun circling, sensing a story that could either elevate or destroy. To some, Carter's connection to the center was a scandal waiting to erupt, proof of hypocrisy, of recklessness, of hidden motives. To others, it was a potential redemption arc, the powerful man humbled by his son's struggle, finding humanity in unexpected places. Reporters sought Elena's words, but she refused them, insisting that the story was not hers to tell. Families begged her to protect their children from the cameras, and she did, shielding them with the same fierceness she used to protect her own dignity. For Carter, the media was both enemy and opportunity. He could control narratives when they were within his empire's reach, but this story resisted control. Every attempt to spin it, to frame it, risked destroying the fragile authenticity of his son's progress. And so he hesitated, caught between instinct and uncertainty, between the desire to lead and the unfamiliar possibility of following. The closure notice was the breaking point. The storm outside roared as if to echo the decision he could not postpone any longer. If he allowed the center to close, his empire would remain intact. His allies would applaud, his rivals would retreat. But his son would lose the sanctuary where progress had finally begun, and with it perhaps the will to continue fighting. If he intervened, he would draw fire from every direction. His opponents would paint him as compromised, reckless, sentimental. His allies would see betrayal. His empire could collapse under the weight of their disappointment. In his office the following morning, the notice sat on his desk like a curse. His advisors filled the room with words, strategies, warnings, calculations. They told him to cut ties, to deny involvement, to distance himself. They told him that sentiment was weakness, that family could be protected privately but never mixed with power. They told him that his legacy would crumble if he chose emotion over empire. He listened, but his mind was elsewhere. It was with David standing in that modest room, taking steps that defied predictions. It was with Elena, facing inspectors and accusations with calm determination. It was with the storm, whose thunder had seemed to demand a choice that words alone could not delay. Days passed, each one tightening the noose. Elena fought the closure through official channels, filing appeals, gathering support, but she knew the system was stacked against her. Families rallied, parents signed petitions, but the weight of political power pressed heavier. The center stood on the brink of being erased, its fragile sanctuary reduced to another casualty of ambition. And then in the middle of the storm, Carter made his move. It was not quiet, nor was it subtle. It was an announcement that reverberated far beyond the walls of the center. At a press conference meant to showcase his latest political initiative, he discarded the script handed to him by his advisors. Instead, he spoke of his son. Not of weakness, not of pity, but of courage. He spoke of the steps taken in defiance of limitation, of the strength found in imperfection, of the dignity that could not be measured in medical charts or political polls. He spoke of the center, not as a liability, but as a model of what the world should become. The room had fallen silent, just as the restaurant had months earlier when his son had first asked to dance. Reporters leaned forward, sensing history in the making. Allies shifted uncomfortably. Rivals smirked, already crafting attacks. But Carter continued, his voice steady, his decision clear. He announced that his foundation would not only defend the center against closure, but would commit to expanding its mission, funding rehabilitation programs across the city, and protecting them from political interference. It was a gamble unlike any he had ever taken. It risked everything, his reputation, his alliances, his empire. Yet as the words left his mouth, he felt something unexpected. Not fear, not loss, but release. For the first time in decades, he was not speaking to control the storm. He was speaking to follow something greater than himself. The backlash was immediate. Allies withdrew support. Rivals sharpened their knives. Editorials condemned him as reckless, as weak, as manipulated. Whispers of betrayal spread through the halls of power. His empire trembled, its foundation shaken by the unfamiliar force of authenticity. But in the community center, something else was happening. Families wept with relief. Children cheered. David, too young to understand the intricacies of politics, simply smiled when his father appeared at the center the next day, not as a distant figure of authority, but as a presence willing to stand in the chaos. Elena watched carefully, still wary, but she could not deny the shift she saw in him. He was still a man of pride, still a man shaped by power. But he had taken a step, not perfect, not complete, but his own first step into surrender. The storm outside began to clear, but the storm ahead remained. The empire would not forgive easily, and the path he had chosen was fraught with consequences. Yet within the fragile walls of the center, there was a sense of something unbreakable taking root. For the first time, William Carter began to understand what Elena had meant when she said freedom was not about perfection. It was about connection. It was about the courage to follow, even when the path led through storms. And as David took another halting step across the floor, Carter realized that the boy had been leading all along. The days that followed were unlike any William Carter had ever known. His world, once defined by stability and control, now trembled under the weight of consequences. The empire he had built over decades showed cracks. Former allies distanced themselves. Donors withdrew with polite but pointed excuses. Political rivals capitalized on his decision, painting him as a man who had lost touch with power. What had once been his greatest strength, his reputation for control, was now turned against him, cast as stubborn pride, rebranded as recklessness. Yet even as his empire faltered, something within him began to shift. It was not immediate, nor was it complete. Pride remained, as did the instinct to defend himself, to fight back, to crush opposition. But alongside that instinct grew something else, something quieter but stronger than he had expected. The recognition that perhaps his power had always been an illusion, and that the truest strength lay in the fragile courage he had witnessed in his son. David's progress became the measure by which Carter judged his choices. Each step his son took, each small triumph, became more important than poll numbers or headlines. At first it was disorienting, even humiliating, to admit that the empire mattered less than the shaky progress of a child's gait. But with time, humiliation gave way to clarity. He began to see that what he had once called power had been nothing more than fear disguised as control. The attacks against him intensified. Investigations were launched into his finances, not because of actual wrongdoing, but because his enemies smelled blood in the water. Anonymous threats arrived at his doorstep, targeting not only him but his son. The center became a symbol, both of hope and of defiance, and with that symbolism came danger. Elena bore the weight of it daily, her determination unwavering but her body weary. She had not sought this fight, but it had found her. Still, she refused to retreat. Families rallied to her side. Parents whose children had found dignity within the center's walls organized, protested, and wrote letters to officials. What had begun as a small sanctuary grew into a movement. The handmade posters that decorated the walls became symbols carried into the streets, bearing messages of resilience and autonomy. The story spread beyond the city, carried by reporters who had expected scandal but found something else. A fragile revolution of dignity born in the most unlikely of places. Carter's name was still dragged through the mud, but alongside the condemnation came voices of support, not from the halls of power, but from ordinary people who saw in his choice a rare glimpse of humanity from a man who had once seemed untouchable. Letters arrived at his office, not from donors or allies, but from strangers who thanked him for standing with his son, for risking something real in a world where risk was usually calculated to the decimal point. David continued to walk. Each day he pushed himself further, his determination unbroken by the noise surrounding him. He began to take pride not only in his own steps but in the steps of others, encouraging children who stumbled, celebrating their victories as his own. He became, without intention, a leader in the truest sense, not one who demanded obedience, but one who inspired courage simply by trying. Elena watched the transformation with quiet awe. She had always believed in the power of freedom, in the dignity of allowing children to lead their own journey. But seeing David grow, seeing Carter falter and yet choose to return, confirmed something deeper than belief. It confirmed that even in the heart of power, even in the man who had once seemed untouchable, change was possible. It was never easy, Never without cost, but it was possible. Carter visited the center more frequently. At first, he stayed at the edges, observing, restless, still clinging to the instincts of control. But gradually, he learned to be present without interfering. He learned to watch without correcting, to support without directing. For a man who had built his life on leading, this surrender was perhaps the greatest challenge he had ever faced. But it was also the most necessary. The storm of politics did not relent. His approval ratings fell. His advisors abandoned him. The empire he had spent decades constructing seemed ready to collapse entirely. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt alive. The fear that had once guided his every move was replaced by something else, something fragile but undeniable. The recognition that his son's freedom mattered more than his own control. The final blow came when his opponents moved to strip him of his most influential positions. It was a calculated strike, designed to end his career permanently. The vote was swift, the outcome brutal. Overnight, William Carter ceased to be one of the most powerful men in the country. To his enemies, it was victory. To his allies, it was betrayal. To him, it was strangely liberating. The morning after the vote, he sat in the empty office that had once been the command center of his empire. The walls were lined with awards, photographs, symbols of power that now felt hollow. He should have felt rage. He should have felt humiliation. Instead, he felt something unexpected. Clarity. The empire was gone, but his son was still walking. The empire was gone, but the center was still alive. The empire was gone, but perhaps for the first time, he was beginning to understand what freedom truly meant. Elena found him at the center later that day, sitting quietly in the corner as David practiced. She did not ask about the vote, did not offer condolences. She simply acknowledged his presence as if nothing had changed, and in a way nothing had. He was no longer a man of empire, but he was still a father, still a witness to the fragile revolution unfolding before him. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of loss and renewal. Carter's name disappeared from headlines, replaced by other scandals, other stories. His empire dissolved, absorbed by those who had once followed him. He was no longer invited to meetings of influence, no longer courted by donors or praised by allies. He had become irrelevant to the world he had once dominated. And yet, in the modest center where children moved to rhythms of their own making, he found a new kind of relevance. He was no longer the man who controlled storms. He was a man learning to stand in the rain without flinching, a man who had discovered that following could be more powerful than leading. David continued to grow, his steps more confident, his smile more frequent. He began to dream not of what he could not do, but of what he could. Elena continued her work, expanding the center's reach despite constant challenges. And Carter, stripped of empire, remained by their side, not as a leader, not as a savior, but as a witness to the truth he had once ignored, that freedom was not about perfection, but about connection. The storm that had once threatened to destroy him had, in the end, revealed something he had never expected. It had revealed that power was not measured in control, but in the courage to let go. It had revealed that true strength lay not in leading others down a path, but in following when someone showed the way. And so, as the season shifted and the storms gave way to calmer skies, William Carter faced a life unrecognizable from the one he had built. The empire was gone, but his son was walking. The empire was gone, but the center was alive. The empire was gone, but for the first time he was free. The story was not over. The challenges were not finished. But in the fragile steps of his son, in the quiet determination of a woman who refused to surrender, and in the resilience of children who had turned struggle into strength, there was a promise that even the greatest storms could give way to light, a promise that even the most powerful men could learn to follow. And in that promise lay the beginning of something greater than any empire he had ever built. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than thunder. William Carter, once a figure who towered over headlines, conference halls, and televised debates, now existed in the shadows of his own city. His name still surfaced occasionally in whispers, sometimes in critical news reports, sometimes in sympathetic op-eds, but the empire of attention that had once surrounded him was gone. In its place, he found something he had never truly known: space. For the first time in decades, there were mornings when his phone did not explode with calls, when no team of strategists waited outside his office door, when no polished schedule dictated every breath. There was simply the quiet routine of a man rediscovering himself. He would walk with David in the early hours before the world was awake, watching his son's determination with every cautious but independent step. Each movement was a reminder that resilience was not measured by grandeur, but by persistence. The rehabilitation center, once a symbol of political transformation, had settled into a fragile rhythm. Elena, with her relentless energy and stubborn belief, kept the program alive despite dwindling resources and constant obstacles. Families came and went, each carrying stories of struggle, hope, and small victories. Within its walls, progress was measured in tiny steps, hesitant smiles, and moments of courage that went unseen by the outside world. Carter supported quietly. He no longer arrived with cameras or speeches. He signed checks in silence, attended planning meetings without leading, and swept the floors after community events without acknowledgement. For some, it was strange to see him this way, but for those who had once feared him, it was proof of a man changed. His presence was no longer an intrusion, but a reminder that even the powerful could choose humility. Yet the calm was fragile, almost deceptive. Though the media storm had quieted, its residue lingered. Old rivals, though satisfied with his political fall, continued to watch. Investigations still hovered in the air, each headline threatening to reopen wounds. Some donors hesitated to associate with the center, afraid of being tied to a fallen figure. And though families filled the rooms, the financial foundation was brittle, stretched thin against growing needs. Carter felt the weight of it each night when the building lights dimmed and he was left alone with his thoughts. He had traded influence for authenticity, but he now wondered if authenticity was enough to keep the fragile revolution alive. Elena's determination burned bright, yet he feared even her flame could be extinguished by exhaustion and endless battles. For David, however, the world was expanding. The boy, once confined by braces and silence, now navigated spaces with growing independence. He laughed more freely, explored more boldly, and carried himself with a quiet pride that no therapy session could have manufactured. Each milestone was a quiet rebellion against limitation, a testament not only to his own will, but to the patience of those who had walked beside him. It was in these moments, when he watched David stumble, recover, and keep moving, that Carter felt the sharpest contrast to his old life. Once he had believed leadership meant control, that power was the ability to bend circumstances to his will. Now he saw in his son the truth he had resisted. Leadership was not about control, but about presence. To stand nearby, to allow struggle, and to celebrate even the smallest victories, that was a different kind of strength. But storms rarely end without leaving behind unsettled skies. Beneath the surface, shadows stirred. Enemies had not forgotten, and not all wounds had healed. The world had shifted for William Carter, but the final test of his transformation had yet to come. Although William Carter had stepped away from the grand stage of politics, the echoes of his past choices followed him like persistent shadows. His resignation had satisfied those who once sought his downfall, yet satisfaction never guaranteed forgiveness. There were still journalists digging through archives, still rivals whispering in corners, still watchdogs eager to drag his name into the dirt again. Every so often, an article would surface questioning the true motives behind his philanthropy, painting the rehabilitation center not as a beacon of hope, but as a desperate attempt to polish a tarnished legacy. For Carter, these reminders were like thin cracks on glass. The structure of his new life appeared stable, but he knew the wrong pressure could shatter it. Each time the center appeared in print, donations dipped. Families whispered nervously about whether their children's classes would continue. Elena bore the strain with stubborn dignity, refusing to let uncertainty show in front of the children. But the weight etched itself into the tired lines of her face. Funding was only one part of the challenge. Legal threats emerged from unexpected corners, inspections called without warning, permits questioned, taxes recalculated. It was as though invisible hands were at work, ensuring that peace would never fully take root. Carter suspected the fingerprints of old enemies, those who thrived on influence and feared any movement that could remind the world of his name. Elena urged him not to step forward, reminding him that the center's credibility depended on its independence from his reputation. It was a paradox he struggled with daily. His resources could protect the very institution he had helped ignite, yet his visible involvement endangered it. To save the movement, he had to remain in the shadows, watching as others carried the banner. At night, he revisited his past with an honesty he had once avoided. He thought of the countless policies he had shaped for political gain rather than human need, of the boardrooms where he had measured worth in profit margins rather than lives. Now he could see clearly how those choices had built the same system that tried to crush him in return. Power had not just corrupted his career, it had hollowed his spirit. But the world beyond his regrets did not pause. Each week, new families arrived at the center, clutching paperwork, hope, and exhaustion. Their stories mirrored one another. Children dismissed by specialists, parents told to lower expectations, lives shrunk by invisible cages of bureaucracy and doubt. In those weary faces, Carter saw reflections of his own son, and he realized that the struggle was larger than his reputation. Still, the threat was real. He knew the center was not invincible. Without stable support, it could collapse under the weight of suspicion and financial strain. And if that happened, it would not only extinguish a fragile sanctuary, but also reinforce the cruel belief that dignity and resilience were luxuries only for those who could afford them. The decision loomed like a storm cloud. Should he remain in the background, protecting Elena's vision from association with his fallen name, or should he step forward again, risking everything to shield what had become his true legacy? The shadows remained, pressing closer each day, whispering reminders that redemption was never simple and peace was never permanent. In the quieter spaces between battles with bureaucracy and the weight of public suspicion, William Carter began to encounter the most profound confrontation of all, the one with himself. For decades, he had built his identity on achievement, recognition, and the relentless pursuit of influence. Now, stripped of office and prestige, he faced mornings where no headlines carried his name and no staff waited for orders. At first, the absence felt like exile. Slowly, it began to feel like freedom. The change revealed itself most clearly in his role as a father. David's journey had been filled with fragile victories, steps taken without assistance, hours of determined practice, moments where laughter replaced frustration. To the outside world, these were small things, but to Carter, they were revelations. Each unsteady movement carried more weight than any political speech he had ever delivered. His son was not simply overcoming a physical limitation. He was teaching resilience in its purest form. There was a time when Carter might have tried to control the process, to accelerate it with specialists and resources, to impose structure on what he believed was progress. But he had learned from painful mistakes that true strength was not coaxed by force. Leadership, he discovered, meant presence rather than command. To stand close without interfering, to allow failure without judgment, to celebrate small victories without overshadowing them. That was a kind of power he had never known how to wield. His reflections often returned to Elena, whose stubborn defiance had once frustrated him, but now commanded his admiration. She carried herself not as someone waiting for recognition, but as someone who understood that recognition was irrelevant. Her work was not about being seen, but about ensuring that others were not invisible. In her, Carter witnessed the embodiment of integrity, unyielding in the face of pressure, unwilling to compromise on dignity. For him, the relationship with Elena was a reminder of his own transformation. Where once he would have sought to dominate or negotiate, now he chose to listen. He realized that humility was not weakness, but a form of discipline, a constant practice of silencing the instinct to control. It was perhaps the hardest lesson of all, harder even than losing his empire, because it required him to abandon the habits that had defined his entire life. And then there was David himself, the unintentional teacher, the quiet force reshaping his father's understanding of what it meant to live fully. Carter watched his son among the children at the center, no longer the timid boy hesitant to stand, but a participant eager to explore. The boy's movements were still imperfect, but his determination radiated something far beyond physical strength. It was the kind of authenticity no amount of wealth or power could manufacture. Through David's progress, Carter saw a mirror of his own internal journey. Just as his son learned to move without braces, he was learning to live without the scaffolding of ambition. Each day demanded practice, patience, and acceptance of failure. And just as David's small steps accumulated into undeniable progress, Carter's small acts of humility reshaped the man he was becoming. The weight of the past remained. Regret could not be erased by reflection alone, yet the future no longer seemed defined by loss. Instead, it was shaped by the possibility of creating something enduring, something that could outlive both his name and his failures. The center had become more than a building or a program. It was a symbol of transformation, for the families, for David, for Elena, and for Carter himself. He knew the final test was still ahead. Challenges circled like vultures, waiting for weakness, but within himself, for the first time, he felt prepared. The man who had once measured worth in influence now measured it in presence. The father who had once hidden his son from public eyes now drew strength from watching him stumble and rise again. The politician who had once spoken of leadership with certainty now understood that the greatest courage was not to lead but to follow. And in that understanding, Carter felt something he had not known for years: peace. Peace, however fragile, rarely lasts unchallenged. Just as William Carter began to settle into his new rhythm of humility and fatherhood, the world reminded him that unfinished battles still lurked beyond the walls of the rehabilitation center. The warning signs appeared slowly at first: late payments from promised donors, anonymous letters questioning the legality of the program, unexpected inspections that disrupted classes. Each incident seemed minor on its own, but together they painted a troubling pattern. It became clear that someone, or perhaps many, were determined to see the center fall. The reasoning was not difficult to imagine. For Carter's old rivals, the very existence of the program was a thorn, a reminder that the man they had toppled still had influence. To dismantle the center would not only erase a fragile sanctuary for vulnerable families, but also extinguish the last spark of Carter's credibility. For Elena, these obstacles were exhausting. She carried the center on her shoulders, fighting every regulation, negotiating every debt, reassuring every worried parent. Carter watched her determination with admiration but also with fear, for he knew even the strongest spirit could be ground down by unrelenting strain. He offered support from the shadows, signing checks quietly, calling in favors discreetly, but his presence was limited. Too much visibility from him risked further attacks. The crisis escalated when the announcement came: the building's lease would not be renewed. Officially, the reason was financial restructuring by the landlord. Unofficially, Carter recognized the fingerprints of political maneuvering. Without a home, the center faced permanent closure. Families wept in the hallways. Children clung to their instructors, and Elena stood in the middle of it all like a figure carved from stone, refusing to bend but visibly cracking beneath the weight. For Carter, the moment was a reckoning. He could remain in the background as Elena had urged, letting the center collapse quietly while preserving the fragile distance that shielded it from his past. Or he could step forward once more, risking everything: his remaining wealth, his fragile reputation, even his son's privacy, to protect what had become more than a program. It had become his redemption. The decision did not come in a dramatic revelation, but in a quiet realization. One evening, after the building emptied, he sat in the darkened hall watching David struggle with a new exercise. The boy fell, rose, fell again, and rose once more with stubborn determination. No applause followed. No cameras captured the effort, but Carter saw in those unsteady movements the truth he had avoided. Progress required risk, and survival required sacrifice. When the news broke weeks later, it stunned both supporters and enemies alike. William Carter, the fallen billionaire, had committed the remnants of his fortune to the creation of a permanent rehabilitation center. The announcement was not accompanied by speeches or political posturing. It was issued as a simple statement of fact: a transfer of wealth, a donation of land, a legal contract that bound his legacy not to boardrooms or campaigns, but to a sanctuary for children who had been told they were less. The backlash was immediate. Critics accused him of seeking redemption through money, of manipulating sympathy, of using children as a shield. Old rivals resurfaced, demanding investigations, digging into every detail of the transaction. The storm he had once fled returned with full force, but this time Carter did not run. He faced the storm not with defenses or counterattacks, but with silence. He had no need to explain himself to those who thrived on doubt. His focus remained on David, on Elena, on the families who needed the center to survive. For every critic, there was a parent who whispered gratitude. For every hostile headline, there was a child who discovered new strength within themselves. The center became a battlefield of narratives, Was it a monument to hypocrisy or a testament to transformation? For Carter, the answer no longer mattered. What mattered was that the doors remained open, the classes continued, and the children found space to lead their own steps. In that crucible of suspicion and sacrifice, the final test was not whether the world forgave him, but whether he had the courage to give everything without expectation of return. And in that surrender, he discovered a truth more profound than any victory he had once claimed. That redemption was not a prize to be won, but a choice to be lived, again and again, in the face of opposition. The new rehabilitation center rose slowly from the ground, its foundation laid not in marble or glass, but in the combined will of families, volunteers, and the resources Carter had surrendered. It was not the most luxurious structure his name had ever been attached to, yet it carried more weight than any skyscraper he had once commissioned. Every brick placed, every room designed, carried the imprint of children whose futures had been dismissed and of parents who had refused to give up. Elena guided the project with tireless devotion, her vision shaping spaces that prioritized freedom over restriction, possibility over limitation. Carter attended often, but never at the forefront. He walked the unfinished halls quietly, sometimes carrying blueprints, sometimes sweeping dust, always present but never commanding. His presence no longer provoked suspicion within the community. Instead, it became a quiet reassurance that he was invested not in image but in permanence. For David, the center became more than a place of therapy. It became a second home. He explored its open spaces with increasing independence, no longer the timid child who clung to the edges of rooms. Each step he took radiated the silent triumph of persistence. Other children followed his lead, not because he was extraordinary in his movements, but because he was ordinary in his determination. He became a symbol not of perfection but of possibility, and that, more than anything, inspired others. Carter himself underwent the most profound transformation. Stripped of political titles and financial empires, he discovered an identity not built on conquest but on contribution. He was no longer a figure measured by headlines, but a father measured by presence, a supporter measured by humility, a man measured by his willingness to follow where others led. His past could never be erased, but it no longer defined him. The world continued to whisper. Some would never forgive, others would never believe. But Carter came to understand that legacy was not shaped by universal approval. It was shaped by those whose lives were touched directly, in the laughter of children who once hid their struggles, in the determined steps of those told they would never walk, in the quiet gratitude of parents who had run out of hope. He found a legacy more enduring than politics. Elena, too, carried her transformation with quiet strength. She no longer saw Carter as an intruder or a symbol of privilege, but as a man who had chosen to learn humility through the hardest of losses. Their partnership was never defined by friendship or rivalry alone, but by shared purpose. Together, they built something larger than themselves, something that could outlive their flaws. When the center opened its doors, the ceremony was modest compared to the grand spectacles Carter had once orchestrated. There were no gilded invitations, no choreographed speeches. Instead, the space was filled with families, children, and staff, whose presence spoke louder than any words. David, wearing only a lightweight brace, walked across the hall with deliberate steps, not flawless but confident. The room erupted in quiet celebration, not because of who his father was, but because of who he had become. In that moment, Carter felt the weight of his journey crystallize. He had lost an empire but gained a truth that empire could never provide. Power was not control. Legacy was not recognition. True strength lay in the courage to let go, to support without leading, to follow when others showed a better path. Years later, as the program expanded into new cities and its methods were adopted across hospitals, Carter remained in the background. He attended board meetings without fanfare, wrote checks without signatures displayed, and watched from a distance as lives changed. The world no longer measured him in headlines, and he no longer sought it. For David, adulthood arrived with independence. His movements were never effortless, but they were his own, shaped by resilience rather than pity. He carried forward not only his own strength, but the knowledge that spaces existed for others like him, spaces that would not have survived without sacrifice. In his quiet determination, Carter saw the culmination of every step he had once dismissed, every truth he had once ignored. The story of William Carter, Elena, And David was never about a fallen billionaire reclaiming greatness. It was about the dismantling of illusions, the breaking of cages, and the rebuilding of purpose. It was about a father who learned to follow his son, a leader who learned that leadership is not control, and a man who discovered that dignity is not given but created in the smallest of choices. Empires crumble, storms pass, and names fade from memory. But the echo of a single step taken in defiance of limitation can ripple through generations. Carter's empire of influence was gone, but the legacy of freedom he helped ignite endured, not in his name but in the lives that continued to move forward. And in that enduring rhythm, hesitant, imperfect yet unstoppable, lay the quiet revolution that had transformed him.